everybody. Welcome to a live stream mutations podcast. This is the first of its kind. I am joined by Stephen T. Harper of What's Your Theory podcast. We've done a lot of conversations. Hey, Steve.
Hi, everybody.
Hopefully you can hear us okay. I'm going to be monitoring the chat window in YouTube if anybody's here live anyway. I'm not sure. But yeah, the idea behind this was to follow up on our previous episode from your podcast, Steve. Well, we really were, like we said, it was a decompression for Game of Thrones. It was kind of just a space for us to air our grievances and kind of reflect on the narrative, the writing, more of the technical aspects of the show, and then some of the philosophical reflections. But in the week that's passed since the finale, there's just been this tremendous outpouring of it's been a social phenomenon in itself. Game of Thrones was already a social phenomenon. On top of it, now the ending was kind of in the spirit of the show in a way, you know, like in the spirit of the show having these shocking moments that startled everybody, that made them react, that made them real, but not in the best way, of course, because a lot of people think that the ending kind of jumped the shark narrative wise, or at least writing wise, in terms of the writing quality. We already talked about that. But so we want to do a little bit of a deep dive again with some of the material that's already out there. People have been writing some great articles and great reflections about the show. And yes, we can still air our grievances about the ending, but and the writing, but I think what would also be good would be to kind of just have a sort of a post-mortem analysis of why the show was important, what was interesting about it, and kind of reflect on, you know, how those qualities of the show kind of failed the show, or the writing failed those qualities and the significance of those things. So we're going to bring in some integral philosophy and consciousness studies and all that stuff, as we usually do. So there we go, for starters. And I think I'm going to try to share my screen with everybody, and we're going to go through some articles here together and just sort of be some talking heads as we reflect on some of these things. So you can see my screen now, right, Steve?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great. So maybe our first reflection would be to kind of just go through this one from the Scientific American. We both just mentioned we really like this one, the real reason fans hate the last season of Game of Thrones. And it's not so much about the poor writing, but really about the narrative lanes that they used. And I think I mentioned this briefly without having access to the article. But yeah, what did you think of this point here, right? That the sociological versus the psychological.
Yeah, I felt it brought up a really good point about whether you go into the detail about the way he's framing it, sociological, psychological. That's interesting, but even beside that, if you don't go into that, fully go into that, the shift in style and technique was noticeable and super frustrating. Again, it's the, you know, what you liked about the thing before, which he's describing as a sociological perspective in writing, that is an interesting take. It's not there anymore. And I believe also this same article was the one where he pointed out so the psychological style is the Hollywood style, with more delineated heroes and basically a more streamlined course of action, right? Mm-hmm. He points out they didn't do that particularly well either, which was the super frustrating part. I mean, when you and I were sort of, you know, live brainstorming alternative endings, those were Hollywood, right? Yeah. I mean, the style, but you really want that if it's a finale, right? Exactly. So give us the big finishes with people squaring off against each other. That wasn't there. But I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about what he's calling the sociological perspective of this. I thought it was interesting in the article. What did you think about that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like what they said, what I highlighted here, what they did is something different, more fundamental. Benioff and Weiss steered the narrative lane away from the sociological and shifted to the psychological. But when they defined it down here, this is what I think makes it clear, right? When they say one clue is clearly the show's willingness to kill off major characters early and often without losing the thread of the story. And the TV show that travel in TV shows that travel in the psychological lane rarely do that because they depend on the viewers identifying with the characters. So right off the bat, just a different philosophy for the narrative. But that was all for, and let me see if I highlighted this part too. Yeah, the as they're saying here, that the rich tapestry, right, and the behavior of everybody was all a reaction to the Game of Thrones, the sociological maneuvering that you had to play and partake in this kind of difficult world, right? So as they're saying here, it was something more than that. You could understand why even the characters undertaking evil acts were doing what they did and how their good intentions got subverted. So it was the sociology of this world and its mechanics and its political games that shaped what the characters did, and even if a good person could be good or not in this world. It wasn't about principles or identity, but about how to play the game and how people are shaped by the game. And I think that was
people's journeys through life. We talked about this the other day on my show, how Daenerys has a journey that winds up with her being the thing that she hates, right? And Tyrion has a journey where because of this perspective that he's doing, it enables you to watch multiple characters behave heroically and wickedly, alternating as the situation calls for it, not because they are good or evil. So it's a shades of gray technique that I don't think we've ever seen it before. He says in this, I mean, not on this scale, or at least on this for this massive of an audience, because he's talking about these two ways of doing it. But before Game of Thrones, there's not a lot. Well, maybe, I guess that's not true. I guess HBO kind of sort of specializes in this, don't they? Sopranos and Deadwood and things like that. The characters can shift in and out.
They can be a little bit, maybe not as much as this, not to this extent, right?
But with the killing of Ned at the end of season 1, that gets a jaded consumer and creator of stuff like this, like me, that gets me off, like, on the edge of my couch, like, what the hell just happened, right? And it does that. It just does that. It was new and different storytelling. And this writer here definitely points out how the difference was the technique. And that is interesting. I mean, he also does mention the difference was the quality as well. It's definitely both. But I think that's an excellent observation that he makes here.
Yeah, and he's saying here, the hallmark of sociological storytelling is if it can encourage us to put ourselves in the place of any character, not just the main hero or heroine, and imagine ourselves making similar choices. Yeah, I can see myself doing that under such circumstances. So, and I think they were really good at writing that when they had the source material to work with, when they kind of were working with the tone and the kind of this is another thing I'm thinking of, because I started to read Game of Thrones just sort of passively in the evenings, right? And immediately I am recognizing that George.R.R. Martin is really good, even though he's willing to kill off his characters. He's really good with character development. He's really able to get them to kind of jump off the page, and in your mind's eye, they're real people, And not every writer is equal with that capacity. So I think it was a combination of really kind of drawing from great writing in the novels themselves, and then this style of sociological storytelling that was Martin's philosophy for these characters. So, but yeah, you're right. And then at the end here, right, why it didn't do well is because the writing itself got fairly poor in terms of when they switched to the kind of more Hollywood psychological narrative, the careful sociological construction and payoff and the kind of both the horror and then the gritty realism of these characters who are reacting to the world that's trying to shape them in ingenious ways, right? These are extraordinary characters under circumstances that are fantastical on the one hand, but also like very gritty and political on the other. And their innovations and their attempts at survival or adaptation to that dangerous, gritty world was part of why we love them. Like Tyrion's a great example, right?
Right.
So when that was dropped away, we didn't have anything to work with anymore. So it was just sort of like the characters sort of dissipated in thin air in terms of the writing. They didn't. The reaction I'm hearing a lot online is, we don't know these characters in this season. They're not the same characters.
It really feels like, as you're watching it, and I think this writer mentions this as well, but it feels like, so I don't doubt that the ending of who winds up on the throne and all that stuff probably came from Martin. But it reads like these guys were just working off of an outline and they didn't flesh it out.
Exactly.
Because like the Bran character who eventually wins, that really comes out of the blue because nobody understands who he is and what as a person. Like we get that he's the three-eyed raven, but we don't know what that means. Every time we see him do something, it's confusing, as we discussed last week. I'm going away for a while, and he turns into a bunch of ravens, and they don't do anything. They just fly around. So why is he the king? Is he a good king? Because, by the way, he seems like he would be perfect to be the main advisor. He knows everything. He doesn't need to be the king. He's the library of memories, right? That sounds much more suited to being an advisor. But in giving you the feeling of working off of an outline, they drop the ball in those painful moments. Like I remember my wife's reaction with she loved Brienne of Tarth and absolutely hated every minute that she was on screen in this entire season because it was all out of character. And I kept saying, like I was saying to you before when we were going to do the show, I was like, give him a chance, hold on, it's going to be fine. You know what I mean? Like they'll come around to it. Well, they never really did. They gave sort of like a nod towards, well, she's developed as a character or whatever, and whatever. But I mean, she was completely out of character. I would buy the one night stand with Jamie, but the uncontrollable sobbing and weeping where I kept saying they're going to give a reason for that. It's not just that she can't stand to be without Jamie all of a sudden. Well, they never did. They never followed up with that at all. The Arya and the Hound, when he suddenly turned around and just jettisoned 8 years worth of character development and said, if you go where I'm going, it'll be the end of you. And she's like, oh, thank you for telling me that. And turns around and walks away. That was like I just heard you exhale. It was so deflating. It was the word that I was going to use. It was like, oh, that's just, who are these people again? But it really sounded, it plays like they're just fleshing out notes on a page instead of actually writing the characters that I don't know what they were looking at. We all knew these characters quite well. We knew how they would react. Like well enough to be disappointed by almost everything that they did.
And those are the two main reactions. One, who the hell are these people? These are not the same characters we've been following for all of these seasons. And then two, did D&D know what they were writing this whole time? Like without the source material, it's as if it's a strange kind of thing where the writers are the same and yet they're acting as if they don't know the material. Or writing as if they don't know the material.
Well, it's another thing in television. The writers are not just the writers; they're making the show. So they're wearing lots of different hats. I mean, it is entirely possible that they were producing this giant epic thing and were so concentrating on that maybe they did just coast through the story in their mind because it was so good. And then when they were left to their own devices, maybe they didn't have another gear to kick in. Or as you said, maybe they had something else to do. Like I still don't understand why they would refuse what HBO was offering. If HBO was offering 8 episodes, why did they only take 6?
That was some news. The whole possibly going for Star Wars, the new Star Wars trilogy. and declining the funds and the episodes for a full 10 episode season for this
10.
final season. Yeah.
Wow.
And I think they were even offered earlier on, let's see, more than the few seasons that we got. There was going to be at least 2 more seasons that HBO wanted to offer. I think that's correct. I'm not entirely sure, but they've been very clear and maybe explicit that they wanted to wrap it up earlier. And yeah, I think that definitely affected the writing. But like we said in the last chat, like this one, we don't need to talk about this one too much. But like we said in the last chat, like I don't know, even if they had more episodes, if it would have been that much better. It might have been a softer crash landing, but maybe still like not a landing that we would feel satisfied by if the writing was still at this level.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but
that was the point that you were making. I was trying to argue the other side, that more time would have made it better, but after watching the final episode, I'm more inclined to think you're right about that. I don't know if this was the way these guys were approaching the story, more episodes might not even have really helped.
Yeah.
It might have been able to smooth it over, mask these deficiencies a little bit.
Yeah. So we don't have to go into this one too much, but even Zizek got involved with this cultural phenomenon, and it always surprises me where Zizek decides to enter the arena of pop culture.
Can you tell me about who he is? I don't really know.
So he's a Marxist leftist philosopher. He's written quite a few books, very, very big books about the dialectic and Hegel, and he recently had a kind of brawl of the century philosophical debate with Jordan Peterson. It's sort of been what the internet has wanted for years.
Okay.
Because he sort of represents the left and then Peterson the right. So, but he's got a few great documentaries. I think you'd actually like him. He's got quite a larger than life personality, writes a lot about capitalism and economics and pop culture.
Okay.
So his films and his documentaries are very entertaining because he'll be always drawing from examples that are in our pop culture reservoir of materials to access and think about, for metaphors and allegories for these concepts. So he's very entertaining as a thinker. But yeah, so he comes out of the woodworks every so often to make some comment. But I didn't really feel like he was saying much here. And as you were mentioning in our tweets, that this whole idea that, maybe he was kind of misreading Daenerys's turn, in terms
I think that the idea of it being like a feminist idea, story is something that's out there. Like it's in, that's something that people talk about on the internet a lot. I don't really buy that. I don't think it's ever meant to be a story about powerful women or any kind of women. I think it's a story about people and the way society works. And, Daenerys is a powerful character. She's a woman, but I don't think the fact that she's a woman is important to it.
Right.
So, like, I don't feel like, womanhood was cheated by turning her heel. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, I just didn't, I never felt that. I felt like I was watching, the drama of humanity being played out. And she was one of the main characters, but I didn't feel like the fact that she was a woman was particularly relevant. I mean, it was, for some of what her character was, but I don't think that was her thing. It wasn't like I'm doing it for my sisters. I don't think she was.
Yeah. Well, this has been brought up too with like Cersei's role when she destroyed the septum and her son jumped out the window. I forget his name. But she, in place of putting a new king on the throne, she took it. And I thought that was kind of interesting. A lot of people have commented and that was sort of an interesting turn for that world, for the context, the sociological context.
Yeah. I'm not saying that's not
but
interesting. I'm just saying I don't think that's what the show is ultimately about. And I think that digging too far into it is going down a cul-de-sac. You know,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not that there's nothing there. I just don't think that that's what the show is really. I don't think that's what the story is about.
Hmm.
It's
Right,
what
right.
some of the characters' journeys might be about, you know.
Yeah.
But that's my take on that one. This one didn't do it for me as much as that other article that you just read. I thought
Yeah,
that
me
the other
neither.
one was more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it is what it is. It's like, okay, the view of Daenerys with mad, furious expression flying on a dragon and burning houses, and people express this patriarchal ideology with its fear of strong political women. But at the same time, I mean, everybody's been kind of a mad, violent person in this show, you
Yeah, I
know?
mean, I think
Um,
it expresses that to people who are really focused on that,
yeah, I
but I
mean,
don't think that's what.
think of Bolton. Like, what what did Bolton? You know, the Battle of the Bastards and that whole thing. You know, that's showing male patriarchy in a horrifying way as well. So
Right.
again, I don't think this is a very deep reading on Zizek's part. But whatever. So that's it for that article. So let's
Okay.
hop on over. So before we go to this one, actually, let's reflect on this. And I've already mentioned this in our last podcast, but I didn't have the quotes available. So I just kind of wanted to bring it up again here. Just the conversation about climate change and how Martin himself has said this. And
Mhm.
this is just part of my own frustration with the show, right? Like, as Martin says here, they're ignoring the threat of winter is coming, which has the potential to destroy all of them and to destroy their world.
Yeah.
And there is a great parallel there to what I see this planet doing here. And I can only think, you know, the allegory for our own time is so prescient, you know, this the political infighting and the culture wars as, you know, and everybody's trying to Brexit themselves away from planetary problems. Meanwhile, you know, there's a giant climate shift,
Yeah.
and very often, you know, these kind of crises in culture are expressed sort of mythopoetically in mythology, right? Star Wars is a great example. You mentioned that before too. And I don't know. This is just sort of like my quibble with the writing in. I mean, most of the writing in the season was anticlimactic, obviously, but to downplay the significance or just not to answer a lot of questions about the Night King and the others, the White
Yeah.
Walkers, just felt like such a not only a letdown, but kind of missing the point of the allegorical quality of the story itself. You know,
Yeah.
allegorical power of Game of Thrones was so relevant for our time. So to just dump that
It
or to
once
make it
again
kind of a
feels
one episode thing, right? Is just it
it
loses.
feels like the writers working off of an outline again. And like
Right.
not
Yeah.
fleshing out the outline. Just that the outline says uh Arya kills the Night King. No,
Mhm.
okay. So let's do a big battle, and at the end of that battle, Arya will kill the Night King. But
Yeah.
what that effectively does is, so you have this massive story that is all about the machinations of the human race and politics and life and spirituality and everything that's mixed in with all of these characters, as we just discussed before, all with their own point of view, being affected by all these various different sociological events happening around them. And we see the great wheel is turning, and you have your time to come up on the wheel, and you have your time to go
Mhm.
down, and the wheel will run you over, and all of those things. And a big part of this story was, but don't put too much thought into that. Don't put everything you have into that, as Daenerys does,
Mhm.
right? Because it's going to come around again, and you're not that big. The world, the universe, life, all of that is bigger than you. And the allegorical story in this is, you guys are worried about all of that stuff. You are ants building an ant hill compared to the end of the world, the end of human life by massive zombie attack, or the asteroid coming, whatever, right? The
Mhm.
bigger than life, the bigger than you threat. And they rendered that into 8 seasons worth of buildup for it was rendered into what I thought was a really good action scene. I know a lot of people hated it, but it worked on my TV. People were talking about how dark it was. I could see it. I thought that episode was a lot of fun. I loved the horror aspect of it with Arya in the library. All that stuff was
Yeah,
really
yeah.
cool. I didn't have a problem with very much of it at all, except, well, there was some logic issues too. Like,
Yeah.
why would the Night King? He's the only weakness that this army has, so he leads the army. Dude, you should be in the back, right?
Mhm.
I mean,
Mhm.
but anyway, the fact that this literally larger than life threat to all existence that makes the rest of the show seem petty is wrapped up by, you know, like a cool move that this young girl does. You know, like if it wasn't for her ability to have sleight of hand and all that stuff, it makes the whole thing small, makes it meaningless, and again pulls the rug out from under the audience. It feels
Exactly.
very unsatisfying.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of unanswered questions that, you know, plenty of these YouTube channels have kind of gone into, the folks who are reading the books and who had all of these theories about, you know, who the White Walkers really are and who the Night King is and how they're related to the children of the forest and the first men. I mean, all of that is a really interesting mythology that I would have loved to learn more about, and I'm
Mhm.
happy that, you know, Martin is still writing his books. I've heard, I don't have the article up here, but I did just read an article saying that he's aiming to have it done by 2020, the next book.
Okay.
So I don't know what that, and I don't know if it's just a matter of he's got the motivation now because everyone's upset about the ending and he wants to give people, you know, another alternative. But
I hope
you know,
that he can do it completely differently. That
yeah,
would be
me
nice.
too. That would be very nice.
Like with different results even.
Yeah,
I don't know
and
if he's free to do that or not.
I think he is. He probably is. His response to the controversy has been, you know, Scarlet from Gone with the Wind. How many children did she have? You know, how many endings are there? Like, it doesn't matter. It's you're talking about fantasy. You're talking about an imaginative story. So these kinds of questions of which one's going to be the real ending, is my ending going to be different, whatever. I think he's playing neutral here, and he probably has to because he's doing like 2 or 3 other shows with HBO after this, and they all sound like they're going to be spin-offs of Game of Thrones. I don't know if they're still going to be in the works now with the backlash. We'll see. But
I'm interested in the career arc of Benioff and Weiss, because
yeah,
it's isn't it interesting that the thing that they were in such a hurry to get to, that caused them to do so much damage to the legacy of Game of Thrones, is, you know, one of the most damaged legacies in you know, in the entertainment business. They're rushing off to make more Star Wars movies.
yeah. It's tragic.
It's ominous anyway.
Yeah.
Both for Star Wars, but I wonder because this was such a big impact thing, you know, that so many
Yeah.
people watched and cared about. And it's one of the rare things where the writers and producers have become famous from it. I wonder if they've become infamous. I wonder if it's going to be a problem for them.
I don't know. I think it probably will.
I mean,
There's
there's
just
not a lot of above the line, you know, writer teams. There's some, but
yeah.
there's not a lot. But they're one, you
Yeah,
know,
they're well,
like
I think
J.J.
with
Abrams at this point. Well, I mean,
right.
earlier J.J. Abrams, not now where he produces everything in Hollywood, but J.J. Abrams of 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that this might sink them, to be honest. You know, I don't, it's not just like, okay, Star Wars fans have been critiqued for being, you know, a minority, the angry ones who didn't like The Last Jedi, and they're just this angry nerd culture, very privileged, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But Game of Thrones has been just as much of a phenomenon in pop culture. And I think it's affected perhaps even more people because it's a serialized show that's out every year. It's been building up in popularity for the past eight or so years. And a lot of people are being affected by this. And a lot of like the kind of the nerd community and the Star Wars community are saying, well, now you know how we feel. So I've been hearing that a lot. So I can only imagine that the outcry against these guys is going to be just unreasonably loud, and it already is unreasonably loud. There's just been an outpouring of videos. I can't tell you how many. Like,
yes,
I looked at a few. Yeah, and there's just been an explosion of these angry rants, and people are just, they're launching their YouTube channel successes based on just doing angry live streams about Game of Thrones, and there's communities springing up out of the blue because of the anger about the show. It's very strange. And I don't mean for this to be part of that, but I'm also kind of in a sly way working with that, because I think it's a good opportunity to explore some of these questions about narrative and storytelling and consciousness. So
I think the kind of stuff that we talk about often is that Game of Thrones is that. Game of Thrones is important. I mean, I don't. I mean, that's kind of where I was going at the beginning of our last conversation earlier this week. Is I don't want to rag on this so much. It is super disappointing, the ending, but I also think it is important to recognize it was a big deal. I mean, it really did bring smart and quality of television making into a mainstream level that it hadn't been before. Because those other HBO shows that we mentioned, they're famous for being great shows, but they didn't have the viewership that this does. Even The Sopranos didn't. I think it was like half of this.
Yeah, and that's probably because of a lot of reasons, but I think the internet and the internet just evolving over time, and the accessibility of like HBO Go, and just HBO transitioning into kind of an internet phenomenon rather than an old cable phenomenon in terms of its accessibility, and just capitalizing on that success of the show has been massive, like, completely massive, meteoric. But yeah, so speaking of that, maybe this is a good opportunity to switch gears now and go into this other article. And I had this image up of Bran with gosh, what is the tree in Winterfell called?
I can't remember.
Fans are gonna hate us, but it's okay. Okay, well, I bring that up because, and I know this is saying how Game of Thrones failed fantasy, but for me, it actually kind of showed why it was important for fantasy, or why Game of Thrones and a lot of fantasy sort of straddles a kind of an evolutionary perspective. And I'm going to be curious, because you were mentioning earlier with your previous conversation with Jeff, or he was going into Game of Thrones a little bit. I'm going to be very curious what Jeff's take on Game of Thrones is from an integral perspective. I feel like mine's going to be very weird and different, and you got to tell me what you think too. But let's kind of react to this first and kind of go through this. Did you read this article?
Yeah, I did.
Cool. Yeah. So Charles Taylor has written quite a bit. He's definitely one of my favorite, more what would you call it? Sort of popular thinkers. He's brought up a lot by people who don't look at the evolution of consciousness, but he's still talking about it. And he's always talking about this move. He calls it the buffering of the self, like the buffering of the modern ego. And basically it's this whole transition, what the author is saying here, the move from a pre-modern world in which humans lived and societies are understood to be permeable to supernatural forces like the dark and the light, angels and demons, right, to a modern world in which both civilization and the individual psyche are buffered against these things. The fairy world, the supernatural realm, kind of evaporates like the dream you had last night, and it's gone, and now you're awake, and now you're in the secular world, right? And it's this sort of waking up in consciousness that Gebser talks a lot about too. But so he's bringing this up in this article, though, because he's saying, a lot of fantasy in a very interesting way are retelling this sort of transformation of consciousness that takes place, moving out of the fantastical and into the secular, right? And you and I have read Tolkien, so Lord of the Rings explored the same thing, very implicitly. The whole idea that the world is sort of winding down from the previous ages in which there were tremendous supernatural influences. Like Sauron is bad, but before Sauron, there was Melkor, who is one of these sort of the pantheon of, basically the pantheon of Middle Earth. There's one god, right, Iluvatar, but in the pantheon, there's these sort of demigods or creator gods that help shape the world, and Melkor is one of them, and he's walking around in the early Middle Earth, and there's these giant monsters and Ungoliath and the giant spider, all sorts of really, really scary giant elemental supernatural forces at work, and those kind of go away, and we kind of move into the Age of Men, and the elves even have to kind of leave Middle Earth eventually because it's just not kind of spiritually or magically infused enough for them. They kind of begin to fade and diminish. So fantasy is the story of kind of the fading of the supernatural, and it's sort of straddling between the secular and the supernatural worlds, and that's what the article is talking about here, which I thought was a great moment for pop culture to kind of pause for a moment and look at its own storytelling and the kind of evolution of consciousness that's sort of implicit in there, that we talk about all the time. So yeah, what did you think of this article?
Well, I mean, I see it as in Game of Thrones, and in the same way of what you just described, like the succession of ages in Tolkien's work. It is about human evolution, but humans also evolving into a front runner position, on the planet. So in Game of Thrones, you see, they still have wildlings, and they still have witches, and they still have dragons. We join the story at the beginning of it after the Dragon King has been deposed, right? So we join the story really at the beginning of an age that is more secular, right? So I forgot what the Baratheon family's deal was, but the Baratheons and the Lannisters, certainly the Lannisters, are more technocrats, right? The Lannisters don't use magic. They are sort of like medieval style kings and queens that are right on the cusp of being like, Elizabethan world. It's closer and closer to our modern world. They're right at the beginning of it, really. Their weapons are giant man-made things that can kill dragons, for example, those giant crossbows. And I feel like Game of Thrones is in a long line of making that comparison. I mean, it's also the Bible, or the Old Testament, where the Old Testament is a succession of people who used to live centuries, right? Abraham lived to be 800 and whatever. And as they get closer and closer to, I guess, the New Testament, they start dying younger and younger and younger for various different reasons. But somehow that story, that the mythology of reaching into the past that's in the Old Testament, comes to a fine point in a world that we recognize, where there isn't really a lot of magic and people have normal lifespans, right? But there's this indication that it used to be different. There used to be, things change. And what seems to be changing, and again, I would keep going back to the wheel, what goes around comes around, but we're at a point on the wheel where humanity is at its apex, as you were just talking about with Tolkien. There's no room for elves anymore. We've got to go off to the Undying Lands or whatever. But we don't live in the Undying Lands. We die, which again is it's why Arya's ease with killing the Night King disappointed. Because it didn't have anything to do with what the Night King was. Humanity could have won that war without even understanding what the threat was, because it didn't actually matter in the battle. Right? So, yeah, I mean...
Yeah, that was the question during that battle, too, was, what does Bran have to do with this?
Yeah.
Who are the White Walkers? And to know who they are is to possibly gain some power over them, right? To know their history. And we thought Bran would perhaps help us do that with his, I'm going away for a while moment. But no. But as this article is saying here, right, like there's a question in a lot of fantasy of establishing the age of men, or the age of the human being, the age of the secular.
Yeah.
And there's usually, fantasy is very interesting because it places us in that liminal zone between what Gebser would describe, the unperspectival world of gods and fairies and the supernatural, and the perspectival world of waking up in, this secular spatial reality in which, the world becomes a sphere or a globe, and it moves away from being a kind of a unperspectival, flat, archetypal reality where the gods are still at play. That all fades away. But being in that straddling between those two worlds is what makes it so interesting and alluring, because it's our world. It has the convincing high definition details of a real world, like Tolkien calls these, the secondary world. But it also has this other aspect to it within that interesting fusion. And there's a tentativeness, right? Like in Lord of the Rings, we're not sure if humans are going to usher in the age of men and the new age of the king, or if it's going to be the age of the orcs, right?
Yeah. You mentioned the liminal barrier between the worlds. I'm asking, is it part of fantasy? Because the way you described that was a little bit different than the specifics of Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones. Is it part of fantasy often, or is it supposed to be a part of it, that the shift is on a spectrum, like a time, like Tolkien and Game of Thrones are both playing with time. It used to be a world of magic, and that's dying out, and thus the age of man is born, right? Is that necessary in fantasy, or is that just typical? I mean, is that just part of these two that we're mentioning?
I wouldn't know. I have to admit, I don't read too much fantasy. But I've read, I've recently read Tolkien, and now I'm reading Game of Thrones. And the fact that these two, I would say, whether or not that's exactly true, the fact that these two major fantasies that have had such an impact on our culture are playing with time is significant enough to consider it, And this article as well talks about a little bit further down, Ursula K. Le Guin, right? And how her Earthsea trilogy, it's more of, or novel cycle, it's more of as he's saying here, it's a combination of bringing the kind of the metaphysical, unperspectival world, and then the secular world in kind of a unity together, sort of an integration. And I find that to be an interesting alternative, because in Tolkien's world, there's definitely a direction, right? We're moving further into the Age of Men, and it seems to be the case as well with Martin's world, where although the threat of the White Walkers is there, we still get the feeling that, it's the age of the first men and the children of the forest are long over, and these are kind of dangerous phantoms that might rise up every so often and threaten civilization, but civilization has to kind of reassert itself and defeat them. It doesn't necessarily have a kind of a peaceful integration or union that he's the author's implying here about Le Guin. So I just find it to be an interesting mechanism to think about the evolution of consciousness, right? Because there may not have been literal dragons flying around, but in terms of the move away from a supernatural world and our consciousness being more oriented towards what Gebser called the magical and the mythic, that happened, So it's just so interesting that it shows up in our storytelling.
It's also interesting from an evolutionary consciousness evolutionary perspective. If you look at these two works, one written in the 1950s, I think, and this one more modern, the point of view that you get in Tolkien is it's traditional and comes from characters like Gandalf, who are obviously very magical and mythical, and his perspective is that as well. Whereas Martin's work, the default perspective, and as you're reading the book, you see that each chapter is named with the name of a character, and it's told from his or her perspective. But the default perspective for most of those people, all the ones I can think of anyway, is modern. Like, those characters are seeing the world that they're living in much the same way that you and I would, or that I would anyway.
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
and that's very different from the way Tolkien was doing it. It is a different perspective, and it does speak to some kind of real-time change.
Yeah.
I don't even
Mhm.
know if you'd call it growth per se, but it's definitely change.
Yeah, I think it's more along the line of what Tolkien was doing, but sort of intensified. And from what I've read about Martin's his writing the books, what he said about Tolkien is that, you know, Tolkien didn't go far enough for his own appetites in terms of the realism of the world and
Yeah.
the details of the world. In an interview, he said, you know, I'm honored to be called the Tolkien of America, right? But at the same time, you know, what I'm interested in doing is pushing the realism further. And you know, he was talking about how the Return of the King ended, and his questions at the end of that story were, you know, well, how did he, you know, set up his society? How did the legal structure work? How did people get fed? How did the trade systems work? What did they do with all the orcs and the armies of the orcs wandering around that
Well,
lost?
that's a very
power?
modern technocratic attitude.
Yeah, very, very practical, very historical, right? So in many ways, you know, Tolkien was in love with fairy, right? And as much as he posited building a secondary world as like a living, breathing, believable world, you know, I don't think he was doing it as much as Martin is clearly interested in doing it. And that's also, I think, the appeal is the secondary world characteristics of Game of Thrones is just so vivid. Like I was saying earlier, it's like it's high resolution, you know.
What do you call the secondary world? What do you mean?
Yeah. Well, Tolkien used that word to describe basically creating fantasy worlds, what we would call world building.
Okay.
But for Tolkien, and I think I don't know where Martin stands on this, but for Tolkien, he prescribed an ontological quality to the stories, that there's a reality to them. They're not just made up in fantasy in my mind's eye just for the sake of it. Like, okay, I'm gonna make up the magical kingdom of, I don't know, I have books on my desk here. Arthur C. Clarke. I have a Clarke book, Magical Kingdom of Clarke, and here's the king, and his name is Arthur. You know, like you can kind of go with that, but Tolkien's argument is that something more than just the human construction of a story enters the story, and we can call them archetypes, but he called them a secondary world. There's a reality to them, and it makes them come to life. It gives them agency. I think a lot of writers just experience that anyway when they're working with their characters, and their characters kind of come to life after writing them for a while. You know, they start to have their own kind of, they want to go a certain way in the story, and you start to write that. You know, we should have another podcast about writing and your books. You know, so but. That's really the idea of the secondary world, and I don't know where Martin stands on that aspect, but I feel like he's definitely, at least in practice, prescribing it. You know, just in his practice of building such a vivid, believable, animated reality with all of these little details. So I forget where I was going with this, other than
I feel like he appeals to a different. He's appealing to something different than Tolkien does.
Well, Tolkien wanted, like, not happy endings exactly, but
Tolkien wanted to be in the old place.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
I mean,
he missed it.
There's this the melancholy aspect of Lord of the Rings, the sense that something beautiful has passed from the world. That's not part of Game of Thrones. It's not that what was before was beautiful. In fact, in many cases, it's terrifying. And in Tolkien, it can be terrifying too. But he was building this world of beauty, and again, you know, talking about integral level stuff. He was building a traditional world of beauty that had the magic elements alive and well. But you know, his people the elves are part of nature, and they're one with it. And you know, that's why his books were huge in the environmental movement and that sort of a thing. I really think that Martin's not talking about that. And in fact, it's interesting that he says Tolkien didn't go far enough. I don't think Tolkien was interested in going in that particular direction at all. That's
No,
not what he
no.
was talking about. And like build it, how does the society work? That's not what he was interested in.
No.
He
He
was
was
interested in what's passing away and what's coming.
exactly, and yeah, what's coming, and as a kind of a redemption of the fall, right? There's a kind of the Christian allegorical element there, right? Is the sort of getting kicked out of Eden, that creation started out a little bit better than it's
Yeah.
ended up.
Yeah.
That there's been a corruptive element so there's a lot more theological and metaphysical themes along those lines in Tolkien. And you're right. I think with Martin, though, like it's that everyone's perspective is already, if we were to fast forward the age of men in Tolkien, like a couple more ages down the road, that's where these guys are in Martin's world. Like they're what? The world was better back then? The White Walkers and the dragons and the children of the forest? Hell no. No, thank you. I'll take my kingdoms and I'm glad they're gone. There's much more of a secular attitude where those things are just legend now, and they're better as legends than something you'd actually have to confront, in the forest. So I think you're right. And which is why I guess I'm saying that they're along the same lines. There's just Martin is much more interested in the kind of the age of men, and he doesn't see it necessarily as a decline. I'd have to read him, honestly, because I've just started reading him, so I don't know, but I don't get that impression. I don't get that impression from the show.
His thing is that, and also building characters. I mean, he has much more multi-dimensional characters than Tolkien does. Tolkien's characters do tend to be good, evil, or on the edge of a fall, like Saruman.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Saruman used to be good, but he became corrupted. But that's explained to you. It's not really shown. You know what I mean? Whereas Game of Thrones is very much about people with all kinds of different inputs coming at them and behaving. Well, the first article we called up, the one that was calling it sociology.
Yeah.
They're affected by the world around them to become the people that they're going to become. And in Tolkien, everybody either became a great hero or a coward and a villain. And in Game of Thrones, it's a mixture of both all around.
Yeah, and with Martin, I think he's raising the historicism of our world, our primary world, what Tolkien called our world. But Martin is raising the historicism and the political intrigue and the power play of this gritty, secular, waking world to, in an interesting way, he's intensifying it and turning it into a myth itself, which is why it's so damn interesting to watch, because it's a drama like no other, and it's not even Shakespearean. It's more grittier. It's grittier and more surprising than that, in terms of the characters that can get killed off, the shock and the surprise, and the brutality of the world, like the kind of the cold ruthlessness of the mechanics of the world. So yeah, there's this element of secularity and sociology in it, but it's also been kind of raised to a higher dimension, right? Or the level of myth. And I think that's another reason why it speaks to us so powerfully, because it's like, wow, that's like our world, but it's kind of like a supernatural secularity. I don't even know how to exactly explain it, but it's interesting. But this kind of brings me to some concluding thoughts. I know we've been going about an hour, but there's just a little bit left that I wanted to explore with you, because the ending kind of brings us into question, and we don't know how Martin is going to end the books, even if he has the similar outline. But in the show, with Bran becoming king, there's a really kind of a weird flip that happens. And I was thinking about this today, right? So if the world is more about this kind of move into modernity, move into like the early stages of modernity and the perspectival consciousness, and the White Walkers were a kind of a threat to undo all of that, the choice of Bran as king is a weird reversal. And I bring this up because I was looking at this article today. We don't have to read it, but just the people are taking issue with like, what? Why is he the chosen one? And it's trying to do it in secular terms because they're voting him in, but then he's this like ancient three-eyed raven with a memory of the world. So there's an interesting kind of, and this could just be chalked up to not filling in the details of the plot. But that made me think, like, I had this clip up. I don't know if it's going to play. So Bran, for me, before I click this, it's like 12 seconds long, but Bran is the three-eyed raven. We don't know who he is exactly, but we at least know the associated structures of consciousness that he seems to be expressing, which is like the more magical and mythical, like he's entering into liminality and trance. He's kind of like a shaman, you know, a wounded healer. You know, he broke his back, but then he's gone on this kind of initiation journey to become this great seer for his civilization.
Right.
So I like that, you know, I like that arc. They could have done more with it perhaps, but there was this telling line in the show from a few seasons back, and I'll just play it for us. Let me know if you can hear this.
Okay.
Can you hear it?
No. No, I don't hear anything.
Oh, okay. All right, good to know. Good to know Google Hangouts doesn't play the audio.
Like your volume was down though. Try it again. Isn't the volume down? And then try it now.
Let's try it. Any better?
No, I can see his lips moving, but I can't
hear
it. Can you hear it?
Yeah, I can hear it. That's okay, but the idea behind this scene, right, is Bran, when he's still Bran, is speaking to the first three-eyed raven, or one of the earlier three-eyed ravens.
Yeah.
And he's saying, you know, he's time traveling, basically. He's going into the past. He has the memory of the world, and he's showing him how to do this. Yeah. And he's saying it's beautiful beneath the sea. In other words, in memory, in the psychic memory of the past. But if you stay too long, you can drown. He says that to him. And Bran is like, well, no, I was at home. I wasn't drowning. I was at home. But the idea is, if you stay too long in the past, it will kind of overcome you. And Gebser, interestingly, is always talking about memory and the waters of memory as being this expression of the mythical structure of consciousness, right? Or even the magical, like the healing waters. And here they are in this kind of cavern talking about the psychic realm of memory. So Bran is really kind of coming from this very ancient, deep, archaic structure of consciousness. So for me, I'm just thinking, like, isn't it weird? Because he's associated with the first men, right? He's associated with the children of the forest, these kind of fairy-like beings that are gone now, or disappearing, that we got a glimpse of in the early seasons. But now he is king. Yeah. So on the one hand, they're shoving this idea of democracy, right? On the other hand, a shaman is the king, who is not even really Bran anymore. He's said it multiple times. He's this sort of collective archetypal being that's the three-eyed raven. So I don't know. There's a weird kind of juxtaposition between the modern and the ancient.
It's a very strange thing to do. I mean, it would be like, you know, it would be like if the Sioux Indians had Black Elk be their leader instead of Crazy Horse. It doesn't work that way. That's not what Black Elk does, right? Yeah. And that's not what Bran does. Bran is a perfect advisor. He knows everything in history. He's really weird. He has a perspective that makes it difficult. Like, it would be difficult for Bran to, I mean, a leader, a king, needs to feel the people, you know, and Bran is really going to be disassociated from all that. So it's a weird choice in reality for any society to do that. I can't think of one that has, and if they did, I'm sure it didn't end well. I mean, maybe some society that was big on human sacrifice or something might have a religious figure as their king. It's a pretty weird thing to do. I mean, I guess, you know, so Church of England, the king becomes the head of the church, but it's not the same thing. The king is not a priest, and he certainly isn't a shaman. He certainly isn't magic, right?
Right.
you have to be secular. So it's a weird thing to do. I would again come back to, it just feels like that it was written in the corner of the notebook that Martin gave him when Bran becomes king. So like, okay, well, we need to make Bran king, and we don't need to go into great detail about it. Just have Peter Dinklage give that speech about having a great story. Like everybody in Game of Thrones doesn't have a great story. In fact, most people have a better story than he does, because I don't even understand his story.
People got so mad about that. There's so many memes about that thing.
Yeah, well, I don't blame them. It was weak. So I mean, I see what you're saying. It is interesting. It would be interesting to see it fleshed out. I'd like to hear why. Like, I'd like to hear, why is he a better king than, say, Sansa would have been, or Tyrion? Like, it would make more sense for Tyrion to be the king, or it makes more sense for almost anyone to be the king, and have people like Bran and Tyrion at their disposal for advice. He's perfect. Yeah. But I don't understand why he would be a good king. And like, I agree with you that it is interesting, but I think it would be really interesting to hear them say why. But I don't know if we can speculate on what Martin is thinking about it, because they didn't deliver it in the story.
We'll have to wait for Martin if he did write this ending, if he chooses to go with it. But I only found it interesting in a kind of ironic way that they're talking about breaking the wheel. They're trying to distance themselves and finally sort of establish the world of human beings, the secular world, right? The buffered age that we were talking about, away from the White Walkers, away from all the supernatural elements. God, please, no more dragons blowing up cities. We're still, there's a desire to get away from all those powerful forces that can undo civilization. And yet, right at the head of the civilization, they've chose someone who has, I don't know if he can have their interests in mind.
Is it almost like, it would almost be like an episode of The Twilight Zone or something, where the human race chooses an artificial intelligent computer to make all of our decisions, because he's not driven by sex and greed and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, actually. So there, is it a breaking of the wheel, or is it just a resetting of the wheel? Because it's just going right back to the old powers of the world. And I was thinking of even the Akashic record, in esoterica. This whole idea is like the living memory of everything that's ever happened, and he's the embodiment of this. So for me anyway, it's like at the heart of the new secular buffered world, there's the embodiment of the unbuffered, unsecular self, somebody who is completely permeable and is kind of a collective entity, not even an individual anymore. And I know you're saying, like, the writers didn't probably think about that. There's not probably a good reason for that. It's just sort of there. But, it's something I've been hearing, like, well, it's kind of interesting because the show ended and the society is evolving now. And I'm thinking, like, not the way they wrote it. If they decided, if they had, like, let's all vote, let's have a constitutional monarchy, let's vote on the next king, and then they chose anybody else, then I would say, okay, yeah, the society is evolving somehow, and maybe there's some kind of early democracy. But
the decision was of this evolving society was like, we haven't evolved all the way up to 1776 yet. We're really evolving to about 1620. The monarchy, it's a democracy, but only with the rich people. And what's weird is they actually brought that up. They brought up the idea of a modern democracy and rejected it. Like, no. We're still around 16 something.
Yeah. Let's one step at a time. Constitutional monarchs. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's still keep the monarchs. But I don't know, because I've had a discussion with some integralists, and that's been like, is this showing the society evolving to some next step, or is it a weird backwards forwards thing where it's like, okay, we're going to have a vote, but we're also going to bring a king back from, like, if we're talking about 1620, then the king is from like 6000 BC. It's like some weird god king from like an ancient civilization. And that's who Bran is. He's like,
it's a great question. I mean, we could speculate on it, but I don't know.
Yeah, we'll have no satisfaction in
Right.
in doing that. But yeah,
I mean,
So
it's not even a philosopher king. It's like you said, it's some kind of god king. I mean, the king literally has powers, so
yeah,
that's pretty strange.
yeah.
Um,
I kind of like it, and like I think it was just poorly written.
mhm.
I don't enjoy the writing of it, but I get a tickle out of like, this is so strange. You guys don't even know what you did here. The ending is very weird.
Mhm.
You kind of undid everything that the article about the buffering of the self was talking about, and
Yeah.
there's a kind of a cultural devolution in all of this that is very strange.
It's provocative too. It's just that
Yeah.
the delivery of it was so vague. I mean, we could imprint anything we want onto it, like, because
Yeah.
it's literally like, I don't get the character. I understand it from the level, to the degree that we've fleshed it out right now, like who he is and what he represents. But that's who he is and what he represents to us. I don't know what it
Yeah.
represented to the people making the TV show, and I don't know what it represented to Martin.
Yeah.
It totally came out of left field. I mean, it might very well have represented just simply not the obvious choice. Let's surprise people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please no.
So speaking of that, before we go, do you want to brainstorm a new ending to the show?
Sure. Yeah. I know we wanted to do that. Do you want to go first? Do you have one in mind?
Well, I have a few things in mind that just I'm strictly thinking about the last episode. What I would do, well, I mean, because again, it's all dropping the ball on the characters, and I actually think it's appropriate to have a Hollywood-ish ending. I want showdowns, fights. I want satisfaction as an audience member, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would do is, going back to the episode just prior, the last scene. Don't kill Cersei and Jaime. Have Cersei wandering around. As you recall, she wanders into under the crypts or whatever, and Jaime's down there, and they have a reunion, and then the roof falls on their head. Okay. Don't do that. We know Jaime's coming, right? She's looking around, whatever. The Hound and the Mountain have their battle, and Cersei should be captured, right? So that in the next episode, she should be brought before Daenerys, because we don't get the satisfaction of having them look face to face to each other.
Mm-hmm.
So she should be brought in to the throne room, the broken, shattered throne room, right? And Daenerys could have a big moment where she reads off a list of Cersei's crimes, which would be fun and cool, like all these things that Cersei did, and then claim the throne, claim it, and say, I, as all of her long list of things, which is always my favorite part of the show, when anybody would introduce her and it would take 10 minutes. And I'm, the breaker of chains and the mother of dragons do condemn you to death by fire. And her dragon is just standing over her shoulder, right? And Cersei gets to talk, and we get some kind of closure for her character besides just staring out the window the whole time that they did. She gets a long speech. She's about to, what's the word? Dracarys or whatever, when they burn, it means light them on fire. She's about to do that. Jaime Lannister comes in the room. He walks in the room and he says, I demand trial by combat, which we've seen on the show before, right?
Yeah.
And they get that same moment where they see each other, and she'll get a moment to be a better character again, saying, no, Jaime, don't do that. Like, they'll just kill you too. And they get the whole speech. If this is only about us, it's not about the rest of the world. Our love is blah, blah, blah. Trial by combat. Okay, fine. No problem. Your opponent is Drogon. And he burns them both. Just lights them on fire in the throne room. And by the way, everyone's watching this. Jon Snow is standing near Daenerys, and I think Tyrion could still be there. He hasn't been thrown in jail yet. But we've had that speech as well. That one scene that I think we both really liked, where Tyrion was in prison and Jon visits him, and they have that long conversation where Tyrion's basically saying, "You need to do this. You've got to kill her." That should be like ringing in Jon's ears, right? But they could all be in the room at the same time and seeing, here's how this is going. Not just her tyrant speech about liberating other people, but seeing, okay, she's just bloodthirsty, right? Maybe then have a next day kind of thing. Maybe that's when you have the speech between Jon and Tyrion. But the next day, Jon's got it in his head that he's going to kill her, need to do it. And what I want to happen is he tries to do it, can't do it. And again, it's like with people in the room, they're not alone. That was also dumb because Daenerys is not dumb. So Grey Worm is there, the Praetorian Guard everybody's there. And Jon wants to do it, and we'll have like a moment where we, the audience, sees that he's gonna do it, and then he just doesn't. And like maybe have Tyrion look down at the ground like he didn't do it. And then boom, Arya, wearing the face of some other person who's standing right behind Dany, stabs her and then pulls her face off and says, "That's how you do it, you dumbass." Right? This needed to be done. And then when that happens, all hell breaks loose, right? Now Jon, who can act as a hero in this regard, I think we can have a cool fight scene where all the not all, but all the ones that are in the room, the close-in guard of what are they called? The eunuchs, the Unsullied.
Unsullied, yeah.
They all go after Arya as Daenerys is bleeding out on the ground, still alive. And there's a big fight, and Arya's doing all kinds of cool, spinning the staff around and fighting for her life. And then Jon joins the fight. Jon faces off against Grey Worm. We get that fight. Big fight in the throne room with Daenerys still bleeding out, but still alive. Tyrion watching, Arya fighting off whatever. Jon kills Grey Worm, right? In an awesome battle. And then at some point, Drogon, who's still there, now squares off against the girl who just killed his mother. And Arya is in his sights, and he's going to kill Arya. Jon steps in again. Now that he's beaten Grey Worm, he steps in between them, and Drogon faces off against him, and we get like that real CGI emoting from the dragon, like, "I know who you are, and I'm going to kill you, you motherfucker." And Arya slips away, as she does, and Drogon lights him up and burns all of his clothes off. But like Daenerys, as you pointed out when we were talking about this the other day, you had that moment where he's a Targaryen. He cannot be burned by this dragon fire. So he's standing naked with his Valyrian steel sword still intact, and it's glowing now because it's like, been burned by the dragon fire. Tyrion says, "There is the true king," right? That proves it. And then Jon goes after the dragon, some kind of, lucky shot or whatever, gets that Valyrian steel up into the throat and have some cool effect where it makes the fire go out sideways or something. And the dragon, I personally think they should both die because I don't want Jon to be the king. I think Jon should die slaying Drogon. And then, I don't know, like, I don't want Bran to be the king because I just don't think that makes any sense. So I don't know how far you can go against the results that they had. Right?
Yeah.
But personally, I think that Sansa Stark should be on the throne with Tyrion and Bran as her top advisors. And I think Jon should die. And that gets rid of all that stupid stuff like the political machinations of the Unsullied are upset that Jon killed their queen. Those guys don't get upset. They kill everybody in the room. They don't sit there and negotiate
Yeah.
dumb ideas where their prize was they get to go live on an island where they can't reproduce and just die out in a generation. Like, that doesn't even make any sense. And
No.
then John wanders off into the woods. I don't get that either. Kill everybody, as the show does. But I think that's my solution to it, and not Bran. I would much rather have Sansa be the queen.
That was a very thorough ending, and I would have preferred that tenfold, 100-fold over what we got.
Yeah.
I would have been way more satisfied.
Just for the action alone would have been.
Yeah, just the action, the payoff, because you're only talking about changing the last episode,
Yeah.
and just tweaking it a little bit,
Yeah.
to feel better about how everybody wraps up, without any of the answered questions, but still seeing everything wrapped up like that.
Yeah.
Would still be more emotionally satisfying, more character arc satisfying. So yeah, I don't have as well thought out an ending, but one of the things that I thought would have been interesting, because the show was trying to play with the breaking the wheel concept.
Yeah.
And I'm even going to go with some of the integral theory folks who've been saying, like, well, it's about the evolution into modernity. I don't think it is. I think they already were in modernity. There really were the stirrings of it, as we've been saying. But what would be interesting, well, there's two main things that I had a problem with. They're not really endings. They're just like different trajectories that I won't finish off. But I think it would have been much more interesting if they didn't defeat the Night King, right? At Winterfell. That wasn't the last stand. That the Night King and his armies just kept heading south. They kind of flooded over them. They had to retreat. They knew they were going to lose. Maybe we learn more about the history of the White Walkers through Bran. I don't know how we'd answer those questions, but regardless, that episode is not where we win. It's a brutal kind of it's a brutal defeat. We're retreating. We're heading south because we know they're headed for King's Landing. Cersei has to face things off. Like, her armies and the Lannisters and King's Landing and the rest of the kingdom has to see the White Walkers, because only the North has really dealt with them. For all we know, like, after we've defeated the White Walkers, right, in the show, everybody could be like, what? Well, the rest of the kingdom didn't have to deal with any White Walkers. So you say you saved the kingdom, but we don't know what went on up in the North. Like, we haven't seen any White Walkers around here. I know they brought the one White Walker down, but whatever. I think it would have been much more impactful if the White Walkers moved south along with the winter that's supposed to last for a decade, maybe introduce other supernatural creatures. And there was that one scene from season 1 or 2 with, like, the old lady talking about the giant spiders and the dire wolves and the White Walkers all kind of heading south of the wall. I think seeing more of those in the season would have been really cool, just as a kind of a psychological payoff, just to see those things kind of making their way into all of the different locations we've seen over the seasons, and the threat feeling like the whole kingdom is at stake, and I don't know how it would have worked out in the end at King's Landing, but
I got a thought for that, because I like the idea a lot that they lose the battle at Winterfell and retreat, and you could actually cover up many sins of why Daenerys behaves in many of the ways that she does. What if they go to King's Landing because they need shelter? Like, we need King's Landing to make our stand. And if Cersei's not going to make the stand with us, then we need to get her out, right? So Daenerys does everything that she's going to do, but you could put, like, the real tyrant stuff, Thanos stuff, into her mind, where we have 10 years of winter coming, and the Winter King is coming to lay siege. We can defend King's Landing, right? But we're going to run out of food. And that's why she burns all of the civilians. She kills everybody there. So it's nothing but my army and this fortress. We will save the human race, but we're going to do it the only way that I'm going to make the tough decisions, right? So you could actually have that whole finish where, Tyrion is like, let them surrender. And she's like, they're not surrendering. They're sealing their fate. And what about the food? Like, have that whole conversation. She could say that. And then the ending, you could do everything that I said, right? And then the last shot is the White King's army, on the horizon, like sweeping across the countryside, and they're trying to quickly rebuild the defenses. Like maybe she didn't blow a hole in the wall. I don't know. But I mean, and then the end. Like, so winter is still coming.
Yeah.
In other words, the existential threat has not been addressed. And we see all of the human machinations and what happens in the context of the spinning wheel, but none of us are addressing asteroid 375 or climate change or whatever.
Right? That'd be a lot of fun. Anything to prolong the White Walkers into the end of the story, I think, would have made it feel more satisfying. I don't know.
Not remove the threat of them. You don't need to remove the threat of them. It's an existential threat. It's better to delay it or something like that. But I think that would be pretty cool. They're there, and now it's like it's the ragtag, what's left of humanity, and we cut ourselves in half with all of our petty infighting. And John would be, don't you understand? We need Daenerys. And the other people are going, look what she just did. And then and it would be great if it wasn't even like a plot. It just happened, Arya killed her.
Well,
fucking had to, right? And then
John's
like, why did you do that? And then he's got to fight the dragon and he dies. It's all Shakespeare, just blood all over the stage, and Tyrion Lannister going, God damn it, nobody listens to me, And then
I don't know if I would have done it like that. Now that I'm thinking about it, I mean, I like the idea of them coming south and kind of fleeing to King's Landing, and even defeating Cersei before the White Walkers, so that the final face-off is with the White Walkers. But as they're moving south, maybe what's his name? I forget his name every time. The guy who sends with the little birds, the little notes to all the kingdoms. He was executed.
Varys.
Varys. There we go. Here we go again. I forgot his name again. Varys is sending notes to the kingdom, all of these different realms. They're all kind of going like, look what Cersei's doing. Like, she's not facing the White Walkers. It's this giant existential threat. Your farmers are being, turned into the monstrous undead. Your crops are freezing over. This is all Cersei's fault. So they're like seeding the entire realm with like hatred against Cersei. So by the time they get to King's Landing, the entire city is an uproar, and she's kept them in the city. But not let's not make Daenerys the villain quite yet. Let's go with Cersei first, because Cersei is still being Cersei in this season. I don't care. Let the White Walkers come. Good. I'm glad they're coming south. Let her do that whole thing. Let them eat cake. Just show her as sort of a mad queen for a little while. Let there be, and here's where the integral folks might like this. Let there be, and not in a great way, but she's overthrown and not defeated by Daenerys or Jon. They're sieging the city. The entire city goes mad, storms the castle, storms King's Landing, pulls her out from her throne, strings her up, cuts her head off. Brutal ending for her. Just like violent, horrible Game of Thrones death. We've seen this, where a monarch is dethroned and deposed and executed in the streets, and there's this sort of mass manic kind of collective violence that just overtakes the city, because the whole season has been everyone worrying about starvation and the White Walkers, and knowing the queen is not doing a damn thing. And now there's an army at the door, and behind that army are the White Walkers, and the kingdom overthrows her and kills her. Everyone's surprised. They thought there's going to be like, to me, that's a gritty kind of socio-political thing that actually happened in Europe, a king that gets thrown out and killed. So something surprising like that, where we thought we were going to get kind of a big dramatic Hollywood payoff where people are fighting each other. No, she doesn't collapse under the ceiling, but she does kind of get taken out, and like an oh my God, that was a horribly shocking kind of thing to watch. And it seems really realistic and gritty from like a medieval city that kills their own monarch out of panic. Then they, I don't know what the next parts will do. Maybe I like the idea that Daenerys doesn't survive this. I like the kind of idea that maybe this is the closure of the age of these supernatural powers. So whether or not Jon gets the throne, Daenerys for one reason or another, her and her dragons die, and maybe Jon dies, maybe not, in defeating the White Walkers.
Yeah,
and
that would be a great ending if all of the heroes,
the matriarch goddess, like she retains her archetypal divine feminine aspect because she's dead, and maybe up close we see like she was doubting things, she's becoming power hungry, and Jon chooses to remember her differently and kind of enthrone her as sort of like, no, she sacrificed her and herself and her dragons to help save the realm and help me defeat, I don't know, just something kind of. And then it ends with the Song of Ice and Fire, right? And they're kind of showing the kind of the calligraphy drawings of Daenerys and Jon and fighting the White Walkers and how that age came to a close, you know? And then, okay, maybe there's a representative kind of voting system or monarchical democracy thing being, you know, there's papers in the streets, there's a change in the realm, there's a new way of doing things.
Yeah.
And somewhere there. But that's
there's a lot to be said for a happier ending. That's a good ending, where Daenerys dies a hero and Jon could either survive and become the king, or he could die too. Like they could die fighting side by side in a battle that they win. And then from the ashes rises this new government.
Yeah, because the whole idea between, like, you had the White Walkers to the north and then Daenerys and her dragons to the south, and there are the two bookends to the story that were closing in on each other, right? But they both feel like they're from another age.
Yeah,
they don't feel like they belong to the buffered self, the secular age. So maybe they don't get to go into this new age. Maybe they wrap it up by closing that age out. And I think that would have felt, we would have had more closure with that, you know?
So I've given a tragic ending and keeping so pretty much with what they were doing for the last episode, and you've given an actual happy ending with a payoff that would resonate in a nice way. That people would have good thoughts towards that for years to come. Both of them were better than what we actually saw by a lot. And there's no reason why either one of them couldn't have been done. No reason at all, other than rushing through it. I mean, because it's not like they're not spending time and money on these things. I mean, this is not a low budget production, you know. If they could have done all that, just save the White Walker battle budget for the end, right? And then have a siege of King's Landing by the humans, and then a siege by the White Walkers, and we've got your last season.
Yeah.
In mine, they wouldn't even have to change anything. Just redo the last episode. Yeah.
Okay, so I think I've kept us longer than an extra half an hour, but
well, at least I'm enjoying Game of Thrones again.
Yeah, there we go. And we'll have the books to look forward to. Hopefully. Cross our fingers. But yeah, thanks, Steve. This was a lot of fun.
It was fun. It's always fun.
Thanks for coming on the channel, and let's do this again sometime. I'll be on your show, you'll be on mine. For there's tons of stuff to talk about. We've got a lot of content to explore. Yeah,
anytime, my friend.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Bye.
Bye.